session is called Disrupted Realism, and we have John Seed, Zoey Frank, and Santiago Galeas with us here. And I want to start by heading straight for one of the words in today's session title, and that we keep coming up against in painting and other art forms, and that's realism. And it's really a tricky word. When you unpack this seemingly clear and simple word, it slowly fritters away to something far more confusing and ephemeral. Rather than take a philosophical entry point and talk about conceptions of reality, I'd like to use a couple of painters as a springboard into the complex notion of realism, especially in its relation to painting. And those two are Francis Bacon and Gustave Courbet, but I'm going to look at them in reverse chronological order. Francis Bacon was repeatedly referred to as an expressionist painter, a label he strongly and repeatedly rejected, as he associated his work with realism. He's often quoted as holding on to this, and this is a quote from him, the brutality of fact. So for Bacon, his work is actually factual. It's real, and it's truly engaged in an embodied understanding of human experience. In fact, when you look up Francis Bacon, he's mostly referenced as a realist. If we wind back about a century, we get to Gustave Courbet and realism, but with a capital R this time. For Courbet, realism was about representing subjects important to our lives as socio-political, collective, and post-industrial animals. At the heart of his conception of realism is socio-political engagement, far closer to what became known as social realism. Courbet himself treated labels with a healthy sense of mistrust and wrote that, and this is a quote, "The title of realist was thrust upon me. Titles have never given a true idea of things. If it were otherwise, the works would be unnecessary." The closest he came to defining his realism with a capital R was this quote, "To be in a position to translate the customs, the ideas, the appearance of my time, according to my own estimation. To be not only a painter, but a man as well. In short, to create living art." These two examples suffice to show how realism is not a simple concept. And yet, too often we think of realism in terms of the famous ancient Greek contest between Zeuxis and Pariasis, a contest that sees the painter most able to deceive through the imitation of nature being most highly rewarded, when actually this imitative notion of realism is closer to a narrow definition of mimesis and closer to trompe-l'œil illusionism, what Francis Bacon would maybe call illustration. Now, someone who has already done much work in rethinking notions of realism is our speaker and today co-moderator, John Seed, whose book Disrupted Realism focused on the work of artists that have a clear tie with our experience of the world, but also look at ways of representing spaces and sensations of disruption. John made an incredible selection of artists for the book, and it's an honor to have Zoey Frank and Santiago Galeas here, whose wonderful work shows just how varied the style, discourses, and approaches can be. I'll turn to our speakers very soon, but before, I'd like to highlight something really important in John's approach to the term disrupted realism. As I've understood from the fascinating conversations I've had with him, this has never been a term that restricts or imposes labels. Quite the opposite. It's about trying to find a common thread to very different and exciting work being made now. I'll take a quick step back to conclude this brief introduction before we move on to our conversation. This discussion of realism and its various mutations and disruptions relates to the way artists play between recognizability and ambiguity. It's a division that has connections to our discussions in previous sessions of the play between form and content, or materiality and narrative. And that division is really the key of all representational, realist, or figurative work. And I use these labels, as always, as expedient, imperfect, sometimes even interchangeable, and as with Courbet, with a healthy skepticism towards labels. We could say that late Titian is once again a fundamental turning point in art history, and had he walked with us today, would have really fitted well into the book Disrupted Realism. At the heart of these experimentations with disruption is a desire to investigate and create different states of equilibrium between the allure of the materiality of the paint and painting's potential to address urgent questions about our experience of the world. So now I really want to turn to introduce our speakers. It's a pleasure again to welcome John Seed, Santiago Galeas, and Zoey Frank. And it's quite fitting to today's discussion of disruption and realism that John Seed had close ties with several Bay Area figuration artists, a group that reclaimed figuration after years of abstract expressionism and so-called non-objective painting. John will be joining me to moderate today's conversation, and I'm particularly looking forward to this exchange as Zoey and Santiago's approaches will hopefully allow us to explore the huge number of possibilities pigment has to offer, from readability as a vehicle for creating historically and culturally rooted narratives, to materiality developing its own internal logic and coherence. So John, thank you for being here. And maybe you could start talking more about the term disrupted realism.
Well, I absolutely will. But first, I have to thank you. It was worth being here just to hear your brilliant introduction, which I enjoyed so much. And I want to tell you something that brought to mind. I was pleasantly surprised that you mentioned Francis Bacon, who was an influence for several of the artists in the book. And I think of realism, if you have to really simplify, I think of realism as being objective. And Bacon was objective because when someone once asked him, "Why are your paintings blurred?" he said, "Because my memories are blurred." It was an objective answer. But again, I appreciate everyone being here. I welcome your interest in the topic. And I want to reiterate what Elina just said. In creating this book, I tried to bring together artists that I thought were relevant and interesting and working at a very, very high level. The book in no way represents an attempt to codify a style or make a definitive statement. It really was a conversation starter. And I'm delighted to know that a printed book has led to this kind of format where across virtual space and across continents, we can continue the conversation. So I'm delighted and honored to be here. I'm going to try to keep my presentation as short as possible because I want to hear what Zoey and Santiago have to say. But let me tell you what I'm going to present to you. For visual interest, I have a 1-minute trailer for the book. And that trailer includes a printed definition that I included. You know, what do I think disrupted realism is? But it's also going to take you through some visuals from the book. So let me screen share that. And then I have a little bit more to say to you. And, you know, cross your fingers. I think the screen share is going to work. So be patient for a moment. What is disrupted realism? Disrupted realism is a term that describes works of art made by artists who have deviated from the norms of realism. These deviations, which may involve one or more formal elements, such as line, form, and color, are made intentionally, often through improvisation, to serve expressive purposes. By disrupting and expanding the tradition of realism, artists may suggest time, memory, and individual experience, or refer to digital, photographic, or cinematic sources. It is a subjective approach to painting that favors perception over seeing and which embraces subjectivity. Let me say a few more things, and I've got a couple more images for people. So what is disrupted realism? It really is an assembly of individual painters who are finding that what you and I would call straight realism, you know, objective or mimetic realism, isn't adequate to express their feelings about their life and their experience and their perceptions. I want to offer that I don't have a traditional view of art history. And that may be partly because I'm a self-taught art historian. I don't buy a view where there's progress in art history, because I think that the artist who made King Tut's gold funeral mask had exactly the same concerns as Andy Warhol did when he made a celebrity portrait. So I have a view of art history as kind of a long, unending line that every artist is equally a part of. And I am just very, very interested in, the subjectivity, the individual efforts of each artist to talk about their experience. I've had one or two people tell me, John, this book is prescient because we seem to live in a time in social political terms where change is at hand, where there's so much disruption, if you will, in the world. And what I say to that is it certainly wasn't planned that way, but I do think that artists are very, very good at feeling the world around them and telling us things that we couldn't be told any other way. That said, I want to talk about the 6 sections in the book. I want to take you inside the book a little bit because I want to, keep re-emphasizing the idea that disruption is not any one thing. So good luck. Back to screen share. Let me get this going. I'll be right back with you. All right. There are 6 sections in the book. And I should tell you that the way that the book was constructed, it was constructed on the internet. I do know some of the artists personally and have seen their shows in person, but they tend to be the minority. Today, for example, it's really, I think I met Zoey Frank briefly at a track conference in Ventura. I haven't met Santiago in person, but I'll probably get to know them better today through Zoom than I really have in other circumstances. But I brought together in my Dropbox, I brought together virtually artists that I wanted to represent, artists that I wanted to understand, and they fell very, very loosely with a lot of overlaps into 6 categories. The first is toward abstraction, and Jérôme Lagarrigue is representing that here with his painting. As Elina mentioned, I came out of Bay Area painting, and I see a connection here in his work to the rough abstraction of David Park or Diebenkorn, but certainly paint itself can be something that leads to formal disruption. Another theme that was prevalent was the theme of the disrupted body. And yes, we do have some still life and landscape paintings in the book, but I have a real interest in the human body and the human being as the greatest vehicle for artists through time. So there are disrupted bodies as a theme, represented, I think, by 5 or 6 artists. Emotions and identities takes us towards the personal, and it also takes us towards a postmodern concern. I think we all know that in postmodern and contemporary art, the idea of identifying with a group, with a minority, with finding oneself, with self-discovery, those are prevalent themes, and they're very much there in the work of several artists in the book. I know when Santiago gets a chance to tell you more about his work, I should tell you I was really interested by the way that his work overlaps, that it seems to break through different worlds and identities and show something that's always in flux and always in formation. He's a really powerful formal artist just in the way he constructs these great conundrums. So he'll tell you more about his own work. Myths and Visions was another section of the book. And I think there's a real strong sense that as people dive deeply into their personal perception, they also move towards the universal, and the universal connects us to myth. So if you wanted to say that I have artists in the book creating a personal mythology, I'd absolutely agree with you. And we'd see connections and overlaps to other styles that have been identified over time. You might see a hint of surrealism, for example, in some of the work from this chapter. Planes, Patterns, and Formations was about collaging, overlapping, breaking up artwork. And there were all kinds of reasons that artists, told me that they did this. Sometimes it's just formal, but other times it suggests time, or it suggests collisions of experience and subject matter. And Zoe's going to be telling us about her work. This is an image of her fantastic large-scale painting, Wedding, which has so much kind of simultaneity and a feeling rather like you'd find in some cubism, that different people in different situations are finding their way towards each other at different times. So simultaneity and a move towards abstraction is a big part of Zoe's work. And finally, in a time where screens and photography and video play such an important role in creating our experience, including our subconscious experience, I definitely found artists that were using painting and photography as sometimes just the subject matter in their artwork, but also as inspiration and as a kind of experience that needed to be filtered, that needed to be dealt with. Well, with that, I'd love to turn the conversation over to Zoey. And Zoey, absolutely a good starting point would be to tell us more about how you came to representing time and change in your artwork.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I feel very lucky to be here with you all. I think I had this, a lot of my development has been in kind of response to this academic training that I had. I was trained in a classical atelier, learning these very traditional skills and thinking about kind of painting in a very straightforward manner. And since leaving that program, my work has kind of continued to evolve as I've tried to encompass kind of more of art history, sort of the way you were talking about it, John. Feeling like, so my initial interest had been in the kind of Renaissance and Baroque, and I was just looking at artists from maybe Raphael to Rembrandt, was, you know, this very narrow kind of conception of what I was interested in art history when I was 20 years old. And then when I left that program, I started to look much further back and further forward. So thinking about how can I kind of bring all of this history into the work in some way. So getting really excited about artists like Piero della Francesca or Giotto and this kind of different sense of space that they're using, and feeling like that kind of flatter space that you see in those proto-Renaissance painters kind of relates to like a Morandi or a de Kooning even, the kind of space that you're seeing as we move into modernism. So a lot of the kind of shifts in the work have come from kind of seeing how I can bridge that gap, how I can kind of pull from all of these different periods of history and kind of collage them together on the surface and find something that feels like my own through that kind of recombining of these different sources. The other aspect, I guess, is this part of time and change that you were just talking about, and getting interested in. I think when I'm seeing paintings, I'm so responsive to actually seeing the kind of tangible paint on the surface, seeing how the painting was constructed, and thinking about how I can let my own paintings kind of let that process be a little bit more open and present on the finished surface. So as I'm making changes and shifts in the work, and I make a lot of changes as I develop these paintings, I don't entirely cover up the parts that are that are shifting. I kind of just let these remnants remain of the kind of previous state, and it all kind of adds to this kind of complexity and richness in the surface for me. So that's some of how that disruption has started to happen. I think both thinking about this kind of flattening of space and thinking about kind of a more kind of collage space of, you know, almost like a quilt or a collage where these forms are kind of pushing together. The forms in the back are pushing forward. The forms in the front are starting to dissolve, and we get some more ambiguity in the space. And then also thinking about this aspect of how I can be engaged with my own process of making the painting, so that making the painting feels like this act of discovery and investigation. So I start with a kind of plan, but it evolves a lot as I go. And so rather than kind of aiming for this finished product that I had in my mind from the beginning, I'm finding something really unexpected on the surface. And those compositions that I find kind of through that process of changing and shifting things feel much more dynamic and unexpected and engaging to me. And I feel like I'm kind of learning through the process. I want to feel like I'm kind of in a laboratory when I go into the studio each time, kind of trying, like having some hypothesis that I have some idea of where I'm going, but then kind of discovering as I go with it.
Santiago, I'll ask you a question as well. So I just love the way that the layering in your work actually joins well with what Zoey was saying, but the layering in your work comes through, and this may be personal interpretation, but it kind of evokes the layers that combine together when we create our own identities. And you're in the section of the book called Emotions and Identities. And when we spoke, you mentioned your work becoming more about representing identities that are not usually represented in paint and in certain contexts. And I'd love you to talk also about this growing social engagement in your work.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a huge honor for me. For a long time, I also took a lot of classes and I did a lot of atelier training. I have been attached to realism for the entirety of my painting career. To the point of like, I went to undergrad. I also went to at Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And then I also took classes at Studio Incominati, both in Philadelphia. I'm in graduate school right now at the New York Academy of Art. My motivation has for a long time been realism. But I've also been going through self-discovery in my 20s, you know, and figuring out like who I am and why I do what I do. So identity has been crucial for that's like the secondary factor. The other big motivation as to like why I'm doing this. It just in like discovering like what it means for me to be like a Latinx person, what it means for me to be a queer person, and that sort of drove me to the point of painting pretty much exclusively queer people of color. And that's my big mission, is to kind of paint my communities these like kind of portraits. You know, I wanna sort of bring up the people that I feel haven't been as seen as I would have liked in art history. And specifically relating to the section of the book, Emotions and Identities, I find myself layering both the conceptual aspects of the work along with the formal aspects, in that my process is kind of starting to intertwine between the two. The painting that John showed in particular is painted on top of an older painting. There's like a piece of someone's mouth just kind of like hiding in someone's neck. And a lot of my paintings do that. Originally they were on top of older paintings, mostly because canvases aren't cheap. But also just because I get bored, you know. I want painting to be interesting. I want painting to be a process that, like Zoe said, is I'm constantly discovering things and constantly discovering like what it is that's going to keep me interested in this. So I have a lot of old paintings that I would just paint on top of, and similar to Zoe, again, leave fragments of them in there. And but I've been trying to do it intentionally these days. Another big aspect is attachment, the sense of attachment to the work that I'm making, and my attachment to realism itself. Like after all this training, you know, after all this figure drawing and figure painting, and you know, I just took a dissection course before the quarantine, studying like the human cadaver and learning every single muscle and really getting obsessive about it. To the end that like I just end up painting over them anyway, you know. The sense of attachment is what sort of makes it both a really enjoyable and painful experience, in that like I choose to paint something really, really, really to the end of it, and then I paint over it, and I know that's gonna hurt, but that's part of the process.
But I love this idea of the activation of the surface through the strata of the mark making, and how that then, and it's really linked to both of your work, and how that actually makes the emotions that you feel and the identities and the explorations, the active explorations, palpable on the surface. So that's a really exciting thing that kind of brings you both together, I think, and it's lovely to hear that.
I was certainly excited by you know, hearing about Santiago and his willingness to paint over and to destroy and to keep going. And it reminds me of a quote I love from Picasso, which someone asked Picasso, "What do you do when you get stuck in the work?" He said, "Oh, I get rid of the very best part." And you know, you can't bore yourself as an artist. If you bore yourself as an artist, you're going to bore the people who are looking at your paintings. And I heard both Zoe and Santiago tell me how and why they continued probing into their own working, making changes to engage themselves and create that kind of dynamism. Really enjoyed both sets of comments.
I think there's something to, like, if I'm as engaged as I can possibly be in the work, if I can find a way of working that feels like it activates me, that more of myself will get into the painting, and that will make the work stronger and more my own, and that people will respond to that. And I think that like every artist has their own way of working that gets them most excited. And for me, kind of solving a lot of the problems on the surface as I go, I feel it gets more of me into it, is kind of one of the ways I've been thinking about that.
I work primarily in portraiture, so a lot of it lately has been about the person that I'm painting. And I've been, in the last couple paintings, doing this sort of interview process, both where I'm talking about the person and their identity and their like experience being a queer person, as well as my own. And it gets to like a pretty vulnerable place. And I've been trying to do that with every single one, and learning about the person, and not just like their experience as a queer person, but just like their interests and what they like, and sort of personalizing the image to that extent. And it's not quite like a commission, because I have complete control over what happens, and that's sort of like the end product is really for like the world less than the person, but it's also still for the person, if that makes sense. But for me, that's sort of the motivating factor, is that this painting is sort of bigger than, well, I'd like to think of it as bigger than myself and bigger than this person. It's about representation, someone seeing themselves in this image. So that is sort of in addition to like the formal aspects of like me painting over things that I enjoy, it's also painting someone that I consider to be very important.
Well, I like that you mentioned the conceptual side of your painting. I think it shows, I think it's part of the strength. And portraiture has always been a collaboration. In any portrait, to some degree, the artist is there and the subject is there. And it sounds like what your process is allowing you to do is to be, extremely personal and vulnerable, but also overt about your goals. And that makes the art so relevant, so powerful for this moment in our social and political history.
Yeah.
So Santiago, when you're doing the portraits, it seemed like a lot of them have these like really exuberant colors and like foliage around the figures, and sometimes there's like extra hands or other elements. I was just kind of curious, like if that stuff is coming out of those interviews. Are you kind of thinking about those things more symbolically, or just kind of more trying to get this sort of mood across that you were getting from that person? How are you thinking about those other elements that you're bringing into the paintings?
That's a great question. Thank you, Zoe. It's both. I think it depends on the person. For some people, they give me, like, some people are talkers, so they're just going to tell me everything, and I have so much to work with. And some people, like, it always gets to a vulnerable place, but then sometimes they'll give me like just kind of the base, and I have to kind of work from there and just see what I can bring to. So like John was saying, it's kind of like I give, they give. It's like a chess match, except less competitive. It's like constantly we're kind of building towards it. And sometimes I'll even like text the person or call them or something and like say like what do you think of this plant or something. Plants are a big part of my imagery as well, and big bright colors. I think that the colors especially are sort of gearing towards the sort of queer language, where I need it to be like explicitly bright, vibrant, rainbow. Like I don't want there to be a question of how queer it is.
I have a question that could be either for Zoe or Santiago or both of you, back and forth. Both of you have what we would call really good training, in the sense that you had atelier training or in-depth training in realism. Is it fair to say that that training held you back as well as giving you tools? I'd like to hear about the interplay between those situations.
I think for me, a lot of, like, all of my work has been in response to it, and it both is still completely informing how I make the work. Like those skills feel incredibly helpful for doing the paintings that I'm doing today. And at the same time, I'm continually pushing back at it and kind of expanding my language from that base. I think a lot of people who go through that training do get kind of trapped by it, and I've been trying right from the beginning not to fall into that. Like, because you can get like learning those skills is so exciting. Like I've done the anatomy classes as well, and you can dive deeper and deeper into just learning those technical skills, and how to figure out kind of, I don't know, how to find the things that I need to make the paintings I want to make at this point. And not just continue to be in kind of that student mode of just trying to get better and better at those specific skills, kind of letting go of that at some point. Although still learning like the specific things that I need for the paintings that I'm doing, I guess.
Yeah, it's like not getting in too deep that you can't get out. Right now I can hear a siren. Yeah, it's like this is a great question, because I have sort of devoted my life to learning about the figure and paint and all these formal qualities in order to be able to like dismantle them. And I think like I might never trust myself to totally know everything about that I want to know about figure painting and drawing and, you know, perspective, the figure, everything. But that's okay. I think I'm finding the middle ground. And like Zoe said, it's you don't want to get in too deep, because then it's like almost impossible to crawl out of it.
I've had a lot of people ask me why disrupted realism now? You know, why this moment? And I think one of the reasons is that there's such a strong generation of well-trained painters. When I went to art school in the late 70s and the 80s, and talked about this a lot, it was very, very hard to find a teacher that could teach you realism, especially in a smaller school. But the rise of ateliers, the rise of academies, they've given you, I think what Zoe mentioned, they've given you that really strong, well-informed statement and tradition to reject or to disassemble on your own terms. And I know that in my generation, if you went to, was talking to someone who went to Art Center in Pasadena, got there and had, you know, the kind of skills that you both have, people would be taken aside and they'd say, well, this is terrific. You're going to make a wonderful illustrator. Because art at that point was, you know, video or conceptual or something else. And I'm delighted to see that now that people in this genre are artists again. And that's part of what the book celebrates.
So what I wanted to say is that there's this kind of push and pull between the traditions and the abstraction, the kind of classical view of representation and abstraction. And there's something so exciting that happens in that, for those of us who are really interested in the figure and its expressivity, that happens in that space, that kind of space that is between, where you get the friction happening. And it's one of the questions that I wanted to ask you both, which was linked to, I get this sensation that the disruption and the ambiguity that layering and reworking and negating and removing that you both engage in actually kind of opens us up and actually makes us aware of the spaces in between, those kind of liminal spaces that you can discover. And that also makes the emotional content really, really a lot more palpable. I was wondering if you could say anything about that.
Sure. I mean, liminal spaces are like, that's my thesis. You know, I find myself constantly digging into my own identity and then talking to the people that I'm talking to, and just kind of finding the spaces in which we both fit in this world and then don't fit in this world. And you know, like me as like often I can heavily identify with someone who's coming in and is like queer, Latinx, first generation American, and these like, it's like a very small population, and particularly in the arts, like all these different facets of a person's identity and like what comes forth in a portrait, what's important, what should be emphasized. It's a balancing act. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about you, Zoe, about these kind of the spaces in between, the kind of glimpses? A lot of your paintings, you get the sensation that you're also kind of privy to something you wouldn't otherwise see. And that way of looking kind of opens up those spaces for us to look differently.
Yeah, maybe it is that aspect of the kind of unexpected that I'm trying to let in, of feeling like things come together in a way that's actually kind of stronger and more satisfying and more interesting when I let them be open. If I have everything kind of planned out, I think I'm not letting that kind of interaction of me in the space observing something happen as fully. I think there's something that that's kind of in this dynamic between the painting and the object that I'm looking at, and me being here just as myself right now in the world, that kind of lets it come alive in a different way. And I think I'm also just really excited by painters who are like Diebenkorn is one of my favorites. So I've gotten excited about Cecily Brown recently, and just these painters who are going between abstraction and figuration. And it felt like when I was going through school that those were in opposition to each other. That we had, and John was kind of talking about that of, when people were going to school, a few decades ago, it'd be, it's all kind of against realism and it's all about abstraction, and wanting to kind of bridge that gap, and really excited by the painters, by de Kooning, letting these things kind of slip and kind of slide between being things that I can grab onto and things that are just paint and just surface. And I think that dynamic relationship just like pulls me in and is what gets me that makes these paintings feel really alive for me when I'm looking at them. And so I've been wanting some of that to happen in my own work. How can I kind of bring those two kind of somewhat opposing forces together in a way that feels kind of genuine to my own experience as I'm observing the world?
I had that strong reaction to abstract expressionism as well. Just there's something really alluring about these dead guys that like you can still see the like particular mark that they made on that particular day, and like that's just like kind of magical to be able to see like how much you can capture in this like really expressive mark with emotion as well as like an actual physicality, whether you're like a de Kooning or a Rothko, and that is just really alluring. And I totally resonate with that, with wanting to kind of like have a piece of that in your own work.
And I was going to say that, I think that again, going back to when I was a student, abstraction and representation were seen as like, different teams, or they sat at different tables. As I said to someone recently, now they're having a lot of sex and a lot of children. And, disrupted realism, which is not a style, I want to be careful about that, but it's about hybridity. There's tremendous hybridity. And talking about the liminal spaces, Elina, viewers have to have a way into the work. And we've all seen very, very well executed realism, and we've loved it and we've admired it, but it can be hard. It can be hard to get to know. It can be hard to be into. And I'm interested in work that leaves space for my imagination because it's not definitive, because it's left some mystery for me. And that's what these artists are doing.
I really am interested in this notion of the way in which ambiguity, how we're so fascinated in painting and in figuration with the spaces, the ambiguity and the suggestivity that brings along, that it actually maps perfectly the way in which our brain is structured. So our brain kind of balances between the need for recognition and categorization, and also the need for openness and finding new answers, and not just falling back on heuristic structures. And so in a sense that opening up space, that liminal space in painting is exactly what the human brain is kind of programmed to be going backwards and forwards. And so when you come across work like Santiago's and Zoey's, you suddenly have the brain kind of going, wow, let me in here. Like, this is amazing. This is exciting. I've got so much to get my ambiguity and openness on, but I can also latch onto things. And it's really exciting. And it's really lovely to hear the involvement with the materiality as well on both parts, and also the involvement of the kind of the engagement of the content. So yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit more, Zoe, about the way in which you kind of layer and that process of layering happenings, because Santiago mentioned a little bit about that process in his work, and how does that happen in your work?
It sort of depends on the projects. I think I'm trying to let it happen naturally, so that it doesn't feel like a kind of a gimmick or something that I'm like setting up to make happen. Like, it feels like it needs to kind of come out of the process for me. So often it's like with these big kind of like the wedding painting that we were looking at with all of these figures, it's that I'm doing my very best idea first, but then I come back to it the next day and it's like, okay, no, my next best idea is something new. And I end up needing to kind of shift the figures and move things around and try and kind of solve pictorial problems by adding and subtracting, or just even adding kind of flat shapes to kind of help try and balance the composition or keep my eye moving through. So, and then in other projects, I've been playing with this aspect of time, and I'm teaching a class on time starting in a couple weeks that I'm, so for an example of that is I've been painting this grapefruit plant out on my back patio as it's growing and maturing. And so every day I come out and it looks completely different. Like the leaves have changed, they've grown, the plant is like getting, you know, the fruit itself is ripening, and then I picked it and ate it. So now there's no fruit there. So I'm actually like responding to something that's shifting as I'm looking at it. And I'm painting outdoors, so the light is changing. And so those kind of natural shifts in the actual motif that I'm responding to end up creating this like necessity to make changes and shifts on the surface in a way that also feels kind of really engaging to me. It creates this sort of urgency and this responsiveness that again, like it lets that little magic kind of dynamic happen of I'm not entirely in control of this. I'm responding to the painting, I'm responding to the changing nature of the kind of objects that I'm looking at. And that can only happen in observational painting. I think it's been really kind of wonderful to come back to those observational motifs that I'm working from that are kind of in flux. Yeah.
And I love, Santiago, this idea that in your paintings, you sometimes kind of really push the work on certain elements, and then you kind of, like this idea of killing your darlings, you kind of go back and you let go of them. How does that feel when it happens?
It sucks. It's so hard. I mean, because I've been committing to this idea more lately of like, because I'll paint over, like I used to paint over paintings that I had no interest in anymore, and now I'm starting to paint over images that I've invested in and knowing that they're going to go away. And it's exciting at the same time. Like it's painful, like, but it's also like but I'm doing it to get a painting out of it. I'm trying to get an image that works for me. And like Zoe was saying, I also recently finished a bigger piece that started from an image of like this big bird of paradise, this big plant. And then quarantine happened, and my partner and I ended up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I'm thinking, like, what am I going to paint now? I'm working from a lot of photography from models, but I ended up painting the forest from life, and it spanned from March to July, so the leaves were changing in the middle of all that, and I had put so much detail into these like spindly twigs and sticks, and then suddenly they're growing leaves, and I'm like, okay, putting a couple dots of leaves every day, and then there's just more and more and more, and I was like, okay, well, there go my branches. Yeah, it's all part of the process. Whether you're painting from life or from photography, it's just not being too attached to one or the other. It's just about following the image, whatever that means.
Well, there's so much to talk about, and I really want to come back at some point, Santiago, to talk about this idea of the way in which paintings almost transmit that energy and the mark making of painters through time, and how there's this kind of agency that's embodied in the work, which is really quite fascinating.
Yeah, hi guys. Thanks so much for doing this. This is amazing. I was curious. You guys were talking about your education, and you sort of skimmed over it, and I wanted to ask something that might take you a little deeper into it. There are very clear avenues that each program puts you through, and painting is so incredibly difficult that you stick to the program and you just get lost in the process of learning. Can you guys talk about either paintings or moments in each part of your training that were like pivots in your understanding of your own work that sort of opened your mind and your work to the possibilities that were to come and that sort of led you in the direction that you took and which took you to where you guys are now?
Sure. That's a great question. I'll start. So I think for me, I had a really like a crucial gap between my education. I talked a little bit about this in the small group conversation, but after graduating from my undergrad, I had 5 years before starting my graduate program, and that was an extremely crucial time for me to figure out who I was as well as what I want to do with my work. I did one particular residency in Ecuador. It was called Residencia Artística in, Treque Residencia Artística. And it was a queer Latinx residency where we kind of got to talk to, so it was celebrating the decriminalization of homosexuality in Ecuador. The 20th anniversary of that. So we got to talk to people who were protesting for that and people who were like watching their friends and loved ones sort of perish at the hands of police and citizens, and just where it was totally legal to treat queer people like garbage. So we actually got to talk to these people, and it got really personal and really emotional. And I left that residency. It was only like a week and a half, but it changed my life. It made me think that like there's so much at stake with what I'm doing. If I'm going to be an artist, I have to say something. I have to be really intentional about what I'm doing and who it's for. So that changed my life. It was just like 10 days in Ecuador, and I walked away a different person.
That's wonderful. I feel like mine sounds stupid in comparison to that. That sounds so meaningful.
No.
I was just also talking in the breakout group about this experience of when I was in graduate school, taking a class about time with Perrin Mahler. That was really helpful for me in sort of shifting the way I was working, and that I had until then followed this very academic approach of building a painting. And I did these kind of experimental paintings while I was there, of painting things as they were shifting, and I didn't have control over them. So I was painting, the first one I did was of my kind of workstation of my cabaret where my brushes and paints were out. And I was using those same materials every day. So I would have to go in and grab a little piece of it and paint it. And then I ended up kind of mounting the painting onto, it was actually painted on 2 canvases, and then I mounted them onto a larger panel and kind of expanded the space. And just feeling like I didn't, like, that it just sort of opened up this world of possibility, that it all didn't have to be solved before I started. And that I could decide on even the parameters of even the dimensions of my surface, as I went. And that has kind of carried through everything I've done since.
I thank you for doing this. And I have 2 questions. One is, I'd like to know from Zoey and Santiago how preparatory sketches play into your, I guess, initial beginnings of your painting, if they do. And my second question, which is for Santiago, when I was a child, we used the term queer to describe people that were unusual. And so I grew up and came back to look at the word queer at some point, which was kind of like a general statement for people who had an alternative sexuality as opposed to heterosexual. And I was just wondering, because you are so much younger and I'm so much older now, is there a specific meaning to that word that's maybe newer that I might not be aware of?
Yeah, I'll start there. So the word queer is sort of an all-encompassing word for like anyone in the LGBTQ community. The Q standing for queer. It sort of encompasses identities from sexuality to gender identity, and anyone in between, and asexuality as well. It's just a way, like an umbrella term, basically. So I identify as queer, but I'm a gay man. Whereas, like, my friend who's a non-binary person who like it just kind of encompasses everybody in that community. So it's sort of been reappropriated in that way as well. Like queer, its original definition is you know, unusual, and then it became slang and like an insult, and now it means the same thing but without the like negative context. It's unusual, but in a way that we're embracing. And then to your second question, I used to do a lot of prep sketches. I personally, I'm just working more with my intuition these days and just kind of starting with an image and not planning it very much. But that's just what I'm doing.
And for me, that varies. Some of the larger, more complex ones I've been doing preparatory sketches for, and a lot of other ones I haven't done any work, and I'm solving all of those problems on the surface as I go, and kind of discovering the painting. So it's a mix of approaches. Yeah.
My question is for both artists and also for Elina and John. It has to do with the concept of liminal spaces that you mentioned, Elina. And when you said that, I went to the concept of Lyman, which I had to look up, and it's the psychological concept is, it's the point at which a physiological or psychological effect begins to be produced in the mind. It's like it's a mental thing. And so my question is, to what degree, as creators, are you guys consciously thinking about this while you're creating your work? And do you, like, is it something that it's conscious, or if it appears in your work, is it accidental? Is it maybe a reflection of the way that we perceive things in our times today?
So I'm looking at sort of just like, it goes back to identity a lot for me, and just the intersections of the different identities that I hold. So like a liminal space being like first generation person, like a Latinx person, a queer person, you know, like every intersection of that, and every intersection of that, how that's affected me and my upbringing and my work, and how it's affected the person that I'm painting, because it is such an individual experience for one person. I have to look at all of those identities, because I can't hide myself from my painting. It's not going to be about like this person and who they are. It has to include myself, because I can't help but include myself, because it's what I'm doing, it's what I'm making. And I'm sort of learning to own that more a little bit these days, and like try to find the facets between who I am, who this person is, and what this painting is, and the spaces in between that.
Nice. Yeah, I think I'm thinking about that too, just that needing to be painting as myself in the world today, and that I'm that I am my own embodied self, and that I've been painting things. Yeah, I've started painting, maybe I'm thinking about it a little bit more formally, but, you know, thinking about kind of painting still lives, kind of looking from above or from the side, you know, rather than kind of presenting things to the viewer. I'm kind of trying to paint things from as I see them, as I'm engaged in the world, from my own perspective. I think that has felt important to me as well, to be kind of rooting my work here. Yeah, nice.
I'd love to add something to that, because I think it ties into the very fact that the dialogues exist. For me, the spaces between things, the spaces where borders tend to exist, and the friction that happens between those spaces is where the interesting renegotiations happen in our society. And so creating conversations that are about different things, looking from different perspectives, and opening up these liminal spaces where you're kind of creating the friction, which is partly warm, partly really uncomfortable. And it forces us to really kind of question our engagement with things. And at the moment, we've started off with painting, because you can create conversations from different points of view and different perspectives. But the idea of the dialogue is also to kind of widen itself, and also maybe we'll have some painters speaking with neuroscientists, and we'll have different arts coming together and colliding, because it's the spaces of collision where you suddenly see the spaces in between, and you realize that you have to also activate yourself to be part of this conversation and the restructuring. So I guess that's just my kind of addition there.
Every painter who paints the human figure deals with or learns about the idea of a figure-ground relationship. And I think that just that formal situation tends to open up metaphors for painters. And so if you look at a Rembrandt portrait, you can be very straightforward about it and say, well, he was awfully good with lighting. And I can see how the dark background employs light to show off the face of that aging gentleman in the painting. But I think to look at it maybe the way we're looking at it now in a contemporary sense, we could say, well, Rembrandt painted a liminal space because it's so evocative and so full of possibility and so inherently abstract because it's paint. It's not a real space, it's painted. Liminal spaces have been around for a lot longer than we think they have in painting.
I was trained to paint more realistically, and I'm wanting to move into more non-objective painting. So I was very curious, do Zoey and Santiago ever paint or think about painting in the future without any objective sort of narrative or reference in their work? Thanks.
I've tried to make, I've made basically one completely abstract painting where it was completely coming out of my, just, you know, responding and thinking about kind of memory and trying to build forms that way. And I think I really like that response to the physical world. I think that's, I'm not sure, you know, I'm kind of open to letting my paintings evolve as they need to, and I don't want to kind of set a trajectory of where I think I'm headed. So I don't know, but I've done that. I've experimented with it a little bit, and I think for me, I'm excited about the kind of friction that coming up against what I'm seeing creates, I guess. So I think I'm more maybe leaning towards the kind of de Kooning, the letting those forms kind of slip, but not entirely disappear. Yeah.
Yeah, same. I think I've done like a few small abstract paintings in my lifetime, and where I totally devoted myself to it being an abstraction. And it didn't, like, I think the parts of my identity that I put forth that are sort of like really important for me don't allow it to be pure, because I think in abstraction there's an element of the person who's making it, but it kind of, like, for me, it kind of sticks there. It's like, this is my hand, this is my gesture, this is what I'm doing. Whereas personally, I needed to be a little bit more about the world surrounding me as well. So I've tried it. And that, like Zoey was saying, I'm not closed off to the idea that that's where I'm going to end up in, 20 years or whatever. I'm very attached to the figure.
I think there's something important about that too, though. Like that, I think abstract expressionism kind of came to the fore just as women and people of color were getting to start painting for the first time in history, basically. Yeah. And that now, as we're coming back to representation, we're having the first chance for people of color, queer people, women to get to kind of express the world representationally from their point of view for the first time. And that's like immeasurably important, I think.
Absolutely.
Really good point. Really good point.
Yeah. One of my favorite abstract expressionists is Elina de Kooning, who doesn't get nearly the same exposure as Willem de Kooning, just because she is a dynamite painter, and she should be so much more recognized than she is.
It's the same with Gwen John. Usually, when you say Gwen John, you say, "Oh, the sister of Augustus John." And actually, if you look at the paintings, they're just amazing.
It's all Gwen.
Yeah, it's all Gwen. So it's wonderful to see that happening, and it's so interesting how that representational facet is also something that is a kind of way in and a way to talk about things.
It wasn't a question so much as a comment on the Elina de Kooning observation. I have, in the last couple of years, been researching Elina de Kooning, and there's positive report on the recognition of Elaine's talents. One, the mother lode of Elina de Kooning was in the family's private collection and was never brought to market. And in the last 24 months, and that inhibits somebody's reputation if their work never comes to market. But in the last 24 months, it has been coming to market. and holy cow, is it on fire.
Yeah.
36 months ago, you could have bought a nice Elaine de Kooning painting for $5,000 to $10,000. Now the sales tax is higher than that on an Elaine de Kooning painting. And there's one particular dealer who's pretty much has access to the family collection and is bringing it to market. And I have been in positions, consultant curators, trying to negotiate on acquisitions of Elaine de Kooning paintings. And oh my goodness, you got to pull the trigger on Monday because it's cost 4 times as much by Thursday. The painting goes up in value while you are on the phone.
Yeah.
I understand that Netflix is turning the book 9th Street Women. And if you're not familiar with that book, it tells the story of 5 women abstract expressionists, including Elaine de Kooning. But it's going to be made into a Netflix series. So take your retirement account and buy an Elaine de Kooning or a Grace Harding.
Oh, no kidding.
Still time.
And she does formidable figurative work. She did one nude her whole life, and it's recently been acquired. And her figurative work is, she did some important people, including John F. Kennedy and whatnot. She did some important portraits as well. And so she's not only an abstract expressionist, and a lot of her work is indeed figurative, especially stuff from the early to mid 60s.
Yeah, she's such a force. I always come back to thinking like it would be so great if she could see the benefit of like what's happening right now, you know, because I'm sure at the time it felt differently because like, you know, Mr. de Kooning got to see a lot of it. Whereas,
well,
like,
you know, they say he who laughs last laughs loudest.
Yeah.
And he's certainly on fire right now.
Yeah.
This is a question for John. I'm really interested in how artists reacted to your invitation to be in the book, or when you told them the title or what the theme was. How did they react to that?
I only had 2 people say no. And I think in one case, an artist maybe misunderstood what I was doing because he was very preoccupied. But generally, you know, everyone was enthusiastic. And another thing, just talk about reactions that surprised me, I thought that there'd be some real hostility to this book from, let's say, atelier-trained artists or, you know, highly skilled realists. I thought they would say that this was something, I don't know, that was maybe dismissing what they were doing. And I have found that trained realist artists love this book, and they keep sending me compliments, and they keep enjoying the book. That was a surprise.
Yeah. For Zoey and Santiago, while I've got your ears, when I'm working on a painting, and I feel like the figure, even though it's recognized so easily, I see so much abstraction in it. And the problem I have is more setting and background, and bringing more abstraction into that instead of, you know, getting more away from what I'm seeing. So what are some of the tricks that you use to bring in something, an element that maybe is not there just for the color or texture or pattern?
Yeah, I would just say don't leave it for last. Is like I would even start with the background and try to make it a step that is incorporated into the entire process of the painting, so that it's not like, here's my figure, and I used to do this all the time, is like, here's my figure, and now the background. And I would have this like little film of like paint where like I didn't touch the figure and it wasn't like incorporating itself in. Well, they've got to be worked on together, wet onto wet, if possible. Like just make sure they're both being worked on, so there's some kind of cohesion, because there can be a mix up between, you know, this is my figure, this is my background. You can see the difference if it's painted that way. Not that that's necessarily how it's being painted, but just, you know, try to incorporate the 2 processes as much as possible.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Kind of even, you know, painting the thing next to it at the same time that you're painting the figure. And I've even been thinking about kind of camouflaging my figures into the space. How can I let the figure not be the first thing we see, or not have it be figure and ground, but an entire painting, a whole environment where each part has equal weight and equal attention. more like a kind of all over composition, you know, like we might see in a Jackson Pollock or something, but that it's moving my eye through the whole space rather than having kind of a figure ground relationship be so distinctive.
So it has been a wonderful conversation. If you have anything to add, the speakers.
But I just want to say from everyone, thank you to the artists who are here, and thank you to Elina. A fantastic thing you've created here. This is precious. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Elina. This has been great. I do have to run, but I really appreciate the conversation. This has been a delight.
It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
It's been so rewarding because the conversations have been wonderful, and also the feedback from people. I constantly get emails after the sessions, and it's just wonderful with ideas, thoughts. People have had conversations with people where the conversations obviously needs to carry on going. And so for me, it's just amazing to have everybody here. And I agree with you entirely that it's the trying to adapt to the current situation and bring out the best of it and do something constructive with it. Start talking in different ways and asking questions in different ways and interacting in different ways. It'll have its negative sides, and it's got amazing positive sides as well. So yeah, and one of the reasons that I decided to make the dialogues on the 1st of every month was that so that it would gradually become almost a ritualistic kind of moment that we could actually come together. And I love this idea of, again, those liminal spaces of inviting people. For me, the Dialogues for Artists in the Changing World started off with painting. I'm a painter. I'm fascinated and passionate about painting. But that there's also the space, and for me, the idea of artists is makers and thinkers in the widest sense. And so slowly it's going to grow, and we'll have conversations between painters. We've already had a writer in one of the previous sessions. We've got a theorist coming up who's a specialist on the anatomical body in the next session. So we've got lots of different kind of points of view that are going to be coming in. And I'm just really excited. Thank you all for making it possible. It wouldn't be here if it weren't for all of your interest.